Hey guys, tonight we're wandering into one of the flattest landscapes ever trusted to human optimism. Not mountains, not jungles, not dramatic cliffs where every step threatens instant doom. Just flat land, very flat land, suspiciously flat land, the kind of landscape where losing your house because you accidentally walked 50 meters in the wrong direction was a perfectly reasonable concern. Tonight, we're traveling through the medieval and early modern Netherlands, where generations of surveyors attempted the impossible task of convincing an entire country that every ditch, canal, pasture, marsh, and windmill belonged exactly where someone claimed it did. Their tools? Mostly sticks, some ropes, wooden measuring poles, primitive compasses, a lot of patience, and confidence that bordered on artistic fiction. If you've ever struggled assembling furniture after ignoring the instructions, you'll fit right in with 16th century Dutch land surveyors. Before we begin, take a moment to like the video if you enjoy slow history. Subscribe if relaxing documentaries help you fall asleep. And let me know in the comments what city you're listening from. Now, dim the lights. Maybe open a window if there's a cool evening breeze. And let's slowly wander across the quiet fields of the Netherlands, where the horizon seems endless and every perfectly straight canal somehow began with someone squinting across a muddy field while holding a wooden stick, long before satellite imagery, before aerial photography, before GPS could tell you exactly where you were standing within a few centimeters. Someone had to answer a much simpler question. Where exactly does my land end? It sounds easy until you realize the land itself refused to cooperate. The Netherlands has never really behaved like ordinary land. It shifts, settles, floods, dries, disappears, returns. Sometimes the sea simply decided it wanted another piece. Sometimes people politely disagreed, usually with shovels. Entire villages, occasionally, woke up to discover that yesterday's meadow had quietly transformed into today's marsh. Property disputes became almost inevitable. Imagine spending 10 years draining a swamp, only for your neighbor to insist your new field had always belonged to his grandfather. His grandfather, unfortunately, had no paperwork, mostly because paper did not survive floods nearly as well as arguments did. Surveyors became the quiet heroes of Dutch society, not celebrated heroes. Nobody built enormous statues to the man who successfully measured a ditch. Nobody composed epic poems about correctly locating a fence post. Instead, they received something much more historically common: complaints. Lots of complaints. Because no matter where they placed a boundary, someone became unhappy, usually everyone. Yet, without these careful measurements, the Netherlands as we know it could never have existed. The famous polders, the elegant canals, the carefully divided farmland, the endless geometric landscape visible from modern airplanes. All of it began with ordinary people carrying remarkably ordinary tools across extraordinarily wet ground. The first challenge was simply seeing. That sounds ridiculous. The country is famously flat. Surely seeing across it should have been easy. Actually, flat landscapes create their own strange problems. Without hills, mountains, or dramatic landmarks, everything starts looking wonderfully identical. One grassy field blends into another. Canals stretch toward horizons that shimmer in damp morning light. Windmills appear almost interchangeable from several kilometers away. Even churches, the tallest landmarks in many villages, could disappear behind mist rolling in from the North Sea. Dutch weather rarely offered perfect visibility. Morning fog settled comfortably over wetlands. Rain arrived with little warning. Clouds softened every distant outline. Sometimes the horizon simply dissolved into pale gray. Surveyors often stood perfectly still, waiting for conditions to improve, not because they were lazy, although standing still certainly required less effort than dragging measuring chains through mud, but because accuracy depended on visibility. One wrong alignment at the beginning of a survey could become hundreds of meters of error several kilometers later, which is an unfortunate way to accidentally donate part of someone else's cow pasture. The Dutch quickly became masters of practical observation. They learned how sunlight changed distant visibility. Morning shadows revealed subtle rises in otherwise flat terrain. Afternoon light highlighted drainage ditches. Even cloud cover affected measurement. Nature constantly interfered. Surveyors adapted, patiently, quietly, repeatedly. If history teaches anything, it's that humans possess astonishing determination when land ownership is involved. Money helps, but cows grazing on your neighbor's grass can inspire truly remarkable engineering. Early surveyors carried surprisingly modest equipment: a measuring rod, wooden stakes, lengths of rope, simple compasses, writing materials carefully protected from rain. Because nothing ruins mathematical confidence faster than discovering yesterday's measurements have dissolved into damp ink stains. Maps themselves were precious. Paper remained expensive. Ink required care. Mistakes meant starting over, which explains why many surviving maps appear almost unbelievably neat. They weren't necessarily perfect. They were simply too valuable to waste. Each line represented hours, sometimes days, of walking, stopping, measuring, checking, walking again. One can almost picture an exhausted surveyor reaching home after 10, muddy, hours only to realize he'd forgotten to measure one drainage ditch. Tomorrow, back into the marsh. History rarely remembers those moments, but they probably occupied most of his career. And honestly, that's somehow comforting. Even famous historical professions spent enormous amounts of time fixing yesterday's mistakes. The Netherlands demanded precision unlike many neighboring regions. In mountainous countries, natural features often created obvious boundaries: ridges, valleys, rock formations, large rivers. Nature did much of the work. The Dutch landscape politely declined to help. Instead, humans created boundaries: straight canals, artificial embankments, drainage ditches, rows of planted trees, constructed roads. Every feature required measurement because almost every feature had been built intentionally. It was an engineered landscape centuries before modern civil engineering became a profession. That's one of the quiet marvels of Dutch history. People often admire Amsterdam's canals, or picturesque windmills, or colorful tulip fields. Those are certainly beautiful, but underneath every postcard image lies something much less glamorous. Mathematics, careful planning, surveying, geometry. thousands upon thousands of ordinary calculations. Because before someone could build a canal, someone first had to decide exactly where strait actually was. And as surprisingly philosophical as that sounds, it occupied generations of surveyors. Imagine explaining GPS to one of them. One day, a tiny object floating far above the earth will tell everyone exactly where they are. He would probably nod politely, then ask whether it also worked in heavy fog. Some questions never change. End of part 1. Part 2. The men who measured an uncooperative country. So, the first challenge was finding where things were. The second challenge was convincing everyone else. Those were not always the same problem. A medieval Dutch surveyor usually began work before sunrise, not because he particularly enjoyed waking early. Almost nobody in history seems to have enjoyed that, but the calm morning air often made distant landmarks easier to see before heat began to shimmer across wet fields. His clothing was practical rather than impressive. Heavy leather boots, already stained with peat and mud. A thick wool cloak for cold mornings. A broad hat to keep drizzle from running directly into his eyes. Nothing about him suggested adventure. If anything, he looked like someone whose greatest ambition was reaching home with dry socks. History, unfortunately, had other plans. His equipment was simple enough to fit into a small cart. Several wooden measuring rods, bundles of sharpened stakes, lengths of carefully knotted rope, a compass, a notebook, ink protected inside wax leather, sometimes a primitive surveying staff, taller than the surveyor himself. Carrying all of it across marshland was less elegant than paintings usually suggest. Every few hundred steps, something became stuck. A boot, a wheel, a stake, occasionally the surveyor himself. The Dutch landscape had an unusual talent for swallowing objects with quiet determination. Mud rarely announced its intentions. It simply accepted another victim. Imagine taking one confident step toward a distant windmill, only to discover the ground had transformed into something resembling cold porridge. Your foot disappeared. Your dignity followed. Shortly afterward, the cart stopped moving. Your assistant tried to help, then he became stuck as well. Some mornings probably ended with 3 adults pulling one boot from the earth while pretending everything was going according to plan. Professionalism has always involved a certain amount of pretending. Despite these inconveniences, the work demanded astonishing precision. Surveyors established temporary reference points across open land. A wooden stake driven firmly into the soil became the beginning of an invisible mathematical world. From that single point, every future measurement depended. If the first stake leaned slightly, every angle afterward inherited that tiny mistake. Errors behaved much like gossip. Small at first, enormous by the time they reached the neighboring village. The surveyor's assistants played an essential role. One walked ahead, carrying a rod. Another watched alignment. A third recorded measurements. Communication happened through shouted instructions and carefully rehearsed hand signals. Wind, however, enjoyed participating. A shouted, "Move left," could easily become, "What?" Or perhaps, I said, "Stop," which sounded remarkably similar from several hundred meters away. Entire afternoons disappeared because someone misunderstood one shouted word. Modern office workers have confusing email chains. 16th century surveyors had crosswinds. Neither system was perfect. The landscape itself refused to stay consistent. Peat compressed beneath every footstep. Freshly drained fields settled gradually over months. Canals widened. Banks eroded. Floods rearranged everything with breathtaking confidence. A perfectly measured field one decade might look subtly different the next. Surveying was therefore never completely finished. It simply paused until nature decided another correction was necessary. Nature remained an extremely demanding supervisor. Sometimes surveyors climbed church towers simply to understand the surrounding countryside. From above, the patchwork finally made sense. Canals stretched like ribbons. Fields formed geometric blocks. Roads connected villages with surprising order. Windmills stood like patient guardians, turning lazily against the sky. Viewed from ground level, everything seemed confusing. Viewed from above, a pattern appeared. It's one of history's recurring lessons. Perspective changes almost everything of your course. Climbing those towers required trusting medieval staircases, which occasionally seemed built by someone who disliked knees. Narrow spiral steps, low ceilings, uneven stone. By the time the surveyor reached the top carrying instruments, he probably questioned every career decision leading to that moment. Still, the view justified the effort. Across the provinces of Holland, Zeeland, Utrecht, and Friesland stretched an astonishing human creation. Not untouched wilderness, not completely artificial civilization. Something balanced carefully between the two. The Dutch weren't conquering nature. That would have been impossible. They were negotiating with it. Every canal represented a compromise. Every embankment an agreement. Every drainage ditch another carefully written sentence in a centuries-long conversation between people and water. Water, however, rarely signed the agreement permanently. Winter storms ignored boundaries. Spring floods laughed politely at property lines. Heavy rainfall transformed roads into streams. A surveyor might return after several months, only to discover his carefully marked reference point sitting underwater. The stake remained exactly where he had placed it. The land around it had simply become a pond. One suspects this happened often enough that surveyors eventually stopped acting surprised. Instead, they sighed, made a new note, adjusted the measurements, and continued walking. Some historians imagine history as a sequence of spectacular moments. Kings crowned, wars fought, great discoveries announced. Yet the Netherlands was slowly built through quieter victories. One accurate measurement, one corrected boundary, one carefully aligned canal, again and again and again. No trumpet sounded. Each time another pasture received proper measurements. No crowds applauded. The cows certainly didn't notice. But centuries later, airplanes flying overhead reveal the result. Straight fields, orderly waterways, precise geometry extending to the horizon. It almost appears inevitable, as though the landscape had always looked that way. It hadn't. Behind every straight line stood countless anonymous workers carrying poles through damp mornings, while wondering whether lunch might finally arrive before another rainstorm Lunch itself was uncomplicated. Dark rye bread, cheese, perhaps smoked fish, sometimes onions. Beer was often safer than questionable drinking water, though thankfully weaker than many modern varieties. Otherwise, surveying might have produced considerably more artistic maps. One can imagine a slightly tipsy surveyor confidently declaring that north seemed approximately over there. Fortunately, most took their responsibilities seriously. The work affected taxes, ownership, inheritance, water management. Entire villages depended upon reliable measurements. Mistakes could trigger years of legal disputes. Nobody wanted their grandchildren arguing over an incorrectly measured ditch, although they often did anyway. Humans possess remarkable consistency. Give us perfect measurements. We'll argue about interpretation instead. As afternoon sunlight drifted lower across the Dutch countryside, long shadows stretched beside canals. The measuring poles cast perfectly straight silhouettes across the grass. Windmills turned slowly in the distance. Birds circled above wetlands. The surveyor closed his notebook for the day. Tomorrow, there would be another field, another boundary, another quiet attempt to bring mathematical order to a landscape that never entirely agreed. And somewhere beyond the next canal, the future of Dutch map-making was slowly taking shape. One observation, one line, one patient measurement at a time. End of Part 2, Part 3. Measuring chains, wooden rods, and the curious science of standing still. Now, our surveyor has crossed enough muddy fields to qualify as part amphibian. His boots have gained several pounds of peat. His notebook has survived 3 unexpected rain showers. And somehow, despite all this, the day's most difficult task has only just begun, actually measuring the land. Modern surveyors carry laser instruments capable of calculating distances in seconds. A medieval Dutch surveyor had something considerably less glamorous, a very long chain, or, if fortune smiled upon him, a carefully crafted measuring rope. It hardly sounds revolutionary until you remember that entire villages, farms, and fortunes depended upon the accuracy of these humble tools. The measuring chain was both wonderfully clever and wonderfully inconvenient. It consisted of dozens of iron links joined together with small rings, creating a flexible line of fixed length. Unlike rope, which stretched when wet, a properly made chain remained relatively consistent, because nothing in medieval Europe was ever perfectly consistent. Iron expanded slightly in summer heat. Cold mornings made it contract. Mud clung to every link. Rust quietly settled wherever moisture lingered. The chain demanded constant care, not unlike an elderly horse or an unusually stubborn relative. 2 assistants carried its ends. One planted a marker, the other walked forward until the chain became straight, not too tight, not too loose, exactly straight, which sounds simple until a stiff breeze catches the links, or one end sinks into soft ground while the other rests on firmer soil. Tiny differences mattered. A single inch of error might not seem significant. Repeat that mistake across hundreds of measurements, and suddenly a canal appears where someone's vegetable garden used to be. The vegetables, understandably, objected. Wooden rods offered another method. These rods were crafted to precise lengths, often marked with carved divisions. Unlike chains, They did not sag. Unlike ropes, they did not stretch. They did, however, require carrying, and a long wooden rod becomes surprisingly awkward when crossing narrow bridges, climbing embankments, or weaving between grazing cattle. Cows rarely appreciated scientific progress. They viewed surveying equipment with mild curiosity and occasional enthusiasm. There are scattered references in local records to damaged stakes, displaced markers, and unexplained interruptions. Historians politely describe them as livestock interference. One suspects the cows simply enjoyed causing trouble. They have maintained that reputation ever since. Surveyors developed remarkable patience. Patience wasn't merely a personality trait. It became professional equipment. Every measurement required repetition. One assistant called out numbers. Another wrote them down. The surveyor checked them. Then everyone measured again. Not because they distrusted one another, although healthy skepticism certainly existed, but because human beings miscount. They become distracted. They sneeze. They step into puddles. Someone always forgets whether the chain has been moved 17 times or 18. Was that the 22nd rod or the 23rd? Better begin again. History often celebrates brilliant inventions. It spends far less time celebrating the invention of double-checking your work. Yet that quiet habit has probably prevented more disasters than any famous battle ever won. As the morning progressed, the sun slowly climbed above the Dutch horizon. Its light revealed details invisible at dawn. Tiny ridges left by old plows, faint drainage channels, subtle changes in grass color, hinting at wetter soil beneath. Experienced surveyors read these clues almost instinctively. To an ordinary traveler, one meadow resembled another. To a practiced eye, every field carried its own quiet biography. This section had flooded last winter. That patch had settled slightly after drainage. Those reeds marked groundwater too close to the surface. Even the direction of growing moss could provide useful hints. The landscape spoke continuously. The surveyor simply learned its language. Not every lesson came from nature. Many came from previous generations. Older surveyors trained younger apprentices through endless repetition. There were no glossy instruction manuals, no online tutorials, certainly no helpful videos titled 5 Surveying Mistakes Beginners Always Make. Instead, knowledge passed from person to person. Watch the horizon, never trust the first measurement. Measure again if the wind changes. Don't stand where the cow is looking at you. That last piece of advice may never have appeared in writing, but it was probably wise. Apprentices spent years learning what seemed like simple work. They discovered that simplicity is often deceptive. Holding a measuring rod perfectly vertical demanded practice. Judging straight lines across shimmering marshes demanded experience. Reading a compass while rainwater dripped from the brim of one's hat required determination. Mistakes became teachers. Fortunately, most mistakes merely wasted time. Rather than lives, surveying was dangerous in quiet ways. Nobody charged into glorious battle. Instead, exhaustion slowly accumulated. Cold mornings stiffened joints. Wet boots softened skin until every step became uncomfortable. Hours of staring toward distant landmarks strained tired eyes. By evening, Even experienced surveyors often welcomed the sight of a warm fire, if one happened to be available. Many journeys required overnight stays in isolated farmhouses. Dutch farmers generally understood the importance of surveying. After all, accurate maps protected everyone's property. Hospitality became part of the profession. A visitor might receive thick vegetable soup, coarse bread, smoked eel from nearby waters, and perhaps a generous wedge of cheese. Nothing extravagant, but after walking across marshland for 10 hours, extravagance mattered surprisingly little. The farmhouse itself often became an unofficial classroom. Local farmers described old floods. They pointed toward forgotten ditches, now hidden beneath grass. They recalled where previous boundary stones once stood before winter ice carried them away. Memory filled gaps that instruments could not. Maps measured the present. People remembered the past. Good surveyors listened carefully to both. Occasionally, disagreements emerged. One farmer insisted the boundary had always followed a certain willow tree. His neighbor claimed it had always followed the drainage ditch. The willow, inconveniently, had fallen during a storm 20 years earlier. The ditch had since been widened. Neither landmark remained exactly as remembered. Human memory, it turns out, can drift almost as easily as a Dutch riverbank. The surveyor became less a mathematician than a quiet judge. He compared measurements with testimony, old records with present reality, geometry with memory. It was delicate work. No equation could completely settle wounded pride. Still, numbers carried authority, especially when carefully recorded, especially when witnessed by respected neighbors, especially when accompanied by impressive-looking measuring equipment. People have always trusted anyone carrying specialized tools, even when they barely understood how those tools worked. As afternoon clouds gathered overhead, the light softened once again. Windmills turned steadily along distant canals. Their sails rotated with calm predictability. Unlike people, unlike rivers, unlike weather, there was something reassuring about those great wooden machines. Surveyors frequently used them as landmarks because they rarely wandered away, an advantage not shared by livestock or boats or certain enthusiastic assistants. One begins to appreciate why Dutch maps gradually improved with every generation, not because a single genius suddenly solved every problem, but because thousands of ordinary people kept refining tiny details. One corrected angle, one improved measurement, one carefully recorded observation, year after year, decade after decade. The process was almost invisible until centuries later, when visitors admired the remarkable precision of the Dutch landscape without realizing just how many muddy boots had made it possible. Tomorrow, our surveyor will leave the open fields behind. He'll venture toward canals, embankments, and the complicated world where water itself becomes part of the map. And unlike dry land, water has very strong opinions about where it wants to go, usually somewhere inconvenient. End of Part 3, Part 4, Canals, Water Levels, and the impossible task of mapping something that refused to stay still. Now, our surveyor has become reasonably confident on dry ground, or at least as confident as anyone can be, while wearing boots that permanently weigh slightly more than they did when the morning began. Unfortunately for him, The Netherlands contains rather a lot of water, not dramatic waterfalls, not rushing mountain rivers, just an astonishing collection of canals, drainage ditches, marshes, streams, flood channels, peat pools, and quiet stretches of water that looked perfectly harmless until someone attempted to measure them. The Dutch relationship with water has always been wonderfully complicated. Other countries generally treated rivers as obstacles. The Dutch treated water like an unpredictable business partner, one they couldn't fire. Water brought trade. It carried fishing boats. It powered mills. It nourished farmland. Then, every now and then, it politely reminded everyone who was truly in charge. Usually during winter, a surveyor approaching a canal first stopped walking. That sounds obvious. Walking directly into canals rarely improved the quality of measurements. Instead, he studied the banks. Were they firm? Had they recently collapsed? Did the water level appear unusually high? Were reeds growing where dry grass should have been? Every small detail mattered. Canals were not permanent objects in quite the way stone roads were. Their edges shifted. Heavy rain widened them. Boats slowly wore away the banks. Muskrats, though not native in earlier centuries, would later become another headache. By burrowing into embankments, nature never truly retired from inventing new problems. Surveyors often relied upon small wooden boats to continue their work. These were simple craft, flat-bottomed, stable, designed for shallow Dutch waterways. Elegant? Not particularly. Useful? Absolutely. The boat became a floating office. Measuring poles rested across its sides. Bundles of stakes occupied one corner. Ink bottles occupied another. Everyone silently hoped the ink remained inside the bottle rather than joining the canal. That hope wasn't always rewarded. Imagine spending hours recording careful observations, only to watch your notebook slip gracefully into dark water. The canal, naturally, accepted the gift without complaint. Paper floated only briefly. Ink disappeared even faster. Somewhere beneath Dutch waterways probably rests an archaeological collection of extremely disappointed paperwork. Rowing required patience. Fortunately, patience had become the surveyor's primary qualification. The assistant pushed the boat forward with a long pole. Another watched the shoreline. The surveyor aligned distant landmarks across the flat landscape: church towers, windmills, large barns. Occasionally, a particularly enormous oak tree. Anything that remained in approximately the same place year after year became valuable. One quickly realizes that surveying depends almost entirely upon trustworthy objects. A tree is trustworthy. A church is trustworthy. The horizon, less so. The Dutch horizon possessed an unusual talent. It appeared perfectly straight, wonderfully calm, entirely dependable. Yet atmospheric conditions constantly distorted distant objects. Warm air bent light. Morning mist blurred outlines. Cloud shadows created illusions of movement. Sometimes distant windmills seemed taller, sometimes shorter. Occasionally, they almost floated above the earth. Modern science calls these optical effects refraction. Medieval surveyors simply called them another frustrating afternoon. Experience taught caution. If something looks strange, wait. If visibility changed, measure again. If the weather became uncertain, perhaps tomorrow would offer clearer conditions. There is quiet wisdom in accepting that some problems improve simply by waiting. Not every historical figure understood this. Kings often declared war instead. The Dutch surveyor usually chose tea. Well, more likely, beer. Tea would become common much later. Either way, waiting frequently proved the wiser strategy. Water levels introduced another layer of complexity. Today, we think of sea level as a fixed reference. In reality, medieval surveyors possessed no universal standard. Each region developed local benchmarks: a carved stone, a church foundation, a carefully protected marker whose height had been observed for years. These humble reference points quietly anchored an entire nation's understanding of elevation. Lose one, and confusion followed. Protect one, and future generations benefited. Some benchmark stones remained respected for centuries. Nobody admired them. Tourists rarely painted them. Children probably ignored them completely. Yet they silently supported canals, dikes, roads, and entire communities. History often rests upon surprisingly ordinary objects. The surveyor frequently visited windmills during his journeys, not merely because they looked picturesque, although they certainly did. The Dutch windmill was an engineering masterpiece. Many pumped water from lower land into higher canals. Others ground grain. Some sawed timber. A few even helped manufacture paper. Each mill occupied carefully chosen ground. Its position mattered. Its height mattered. The direction of prevailing winds mattered. Surveyors often measured around these great wooden machines because they served as dependable landmarks, visible from remarkable distances. Standing beneath one was an unforgettable experience. The sails rotated slowly overhead. Massive wooden gears creaked rhythmically inside. Every movement spoke of careful craftsmanship. No roaring engines, no electrical hum, just timber, wind, and patience. One almost hears history breathing. Millers themselves often became unexpected sources of local knowledge. They observed weather every day. They noticed changing water levels. They knew which fields flooded first after heavy rain. They remembered storms that damaged embankments decades earlier. A good surveyor listened, not because millers possessed scientific instruments, but because long experience sometimes measures more accurately than complicated devices. Local memory remained one of the surveyor's finest tools. It weighed nothing, cost nothing, and occasionally proved priceless. Of course, local memory also had a habit of disagreeing with neighboring local memory. One elderly farmer insisted a canal once curved farther east. Another swore it had always followed its present course. A fisherman quietly claimed both men were wrong. He had sailed there since childhood. His father had done the same. His grandfather too. Everyone possessed confidence. Not everyone possessed accuracy. The surveyor politely thanked each witness, then trusted his measurements. Mostly, as evening approached, sunlight reflected softly across calm canals. The entire landscape glowed golden. Reeds rustled gently along the banks. Waterbirds skimmed low across the surface. In the distance, church bells drifted through cool air. For a brief moment, The Netherlands appeared perfectly peaceful. One could almost forget how much labor created this quiet order. Every canal represented countless hours of digging. Every embankment required maintenance. Every field demanded drainage. Nothing here existed by accident. The surveyor understood this better than most. His maps gradually revealed an astonishing truth. The Netherlands wasn't merely inhabited, it was continuously rebuilt. Every generation inherited unfinished work. Every generation added another careful improvement, another canal, another dike, another corrected boundary, another measured field. History often celebrates sudden revolutions. The Dutch countryside tells a different story, one of slow determination, patient engineering, quiet mathematics, and ordinary people, solving the same practical problems again and again until an entire nation emerged from water and mud. In our next chapter, we'll meet the skilled map makers waiting in busy Dutch towns, artists, mathematicians, and craftsmen who transformed muddy field notes into beautiful maps that merchants, sailors, nobles, and governments would treasure for generations. End of Part 4, Part 5. The mapmakers who turned mud into masterpieces. Eventually, every surveyor reached the same satisfying moment. The measuring rods were packed away. The chains were cleaned. The last wooden stake had been pulled from the ground. His notebook was full. His boots were still muddy. Some things never changed. Now came the part that most people imagined when they heard the word map maker. A quiet room, a large wooden table, sheets of expensive paper, carefully sharpened quills, ink prepared with almost ceremonial attention, sunlight filtering through leaded glass windows. It sounds wonderfully peaceful, and sometimes it was. Other times, it involved a surveyor attempting to explain 3 weeks of muddy measurements to a cartographer who had never left the comfort of his workshop. Communication was interesting. The cartographer would ask a perfectly reasonable question. How wide was the canal? The surveyor would answer. Approximately 12 rods. The cartographer would ask, exactly 12? The surveyor would pause. It was raining. That usually explained everything. The Dutch Republic would eventually become one of Europe's greatest centers of map-making, long before GPS, long before satellites. Dutch maps became famous across the continent for their astonishing beauty and remarkable accuracy. But every elegant map began as something much less glamorous. Pages covered with numbers, corrections, small sketches, tiny notes squeezed into the margins. Fence moved, old oak missing, canal deeper after flood, cow chased assistant. Well, perhaps not the last one, although one suspects it happened often enough. A professional cartographer possessed remarkable skills. He wasn't merely copying measurements. He was translating the physical world into symbols that anyone could understand. A winding canal became a graceful blue line. A windmill became a tiny drawing. Church towers appeared as neat little icons. Roads stretched confidently across the page. Looking at the finished result, one might imagine the countryside had always been so orderly. Reality was considerably muddier, literally. The workshop itself smelled of paper, glue, drying ink, beeswax candles, and freshly cut wood. Large tables occupied the brightest parts of the room. Shelves held rolled maps, tied carefully with ribbon. Copper engraving plates leaned against walls. Compasses, rulers, dividers, and protractors rested exactly where experienced hands expected to find them. Everything had its place. Unlike the countryside, the cartographer began by creating a framework. Straight reference lines, measured distances, carefully calculated angles. Only then did the landscape slowly emerge. A river here, a village there, a church, several farms, drainage ditches, tiny bridges. Every feature found its proper location, at least according to the surveyor. If another surveyor had visited first, the debate might continue for several afternoons. Accuracy improved steadily. Perfection remained politely out of reach. Maps served many purposes. Farmers wanted boundaries. Merchants wanted roads. Sailors wanted waterways. Tax collectors wanted property records. Military commanders wanted everything. History repeatedly demonstrates that generals adore maps, preferably someone else's accurate maps. Dutch governments increasingly relied upon these detailed surveys. Building new canals required planning. Constructing stronger dikes required careful measurements. Managing floods required understanding every stream, ditch, and embankment. Without maps, the entire system became guesswork. Guesswork and water have never formed a particularly successful partnership. The sea rarely rewards optimism. As Dutch trade expanded across Europe during the 16th and 17th centuries, maps themselves became valuable exports. Merchants carried them aboard ships. Universities purchased them. Princes decorated libraries with beautifully colored examples. Some wealthy collectors framed them as works of art. And honestly, they were works of art. Many surviving Dutch maps remain breathtaking, borders filled with elaborate decorations, sea monsters swimming across empty oceans, ships sailing proudly through carefully painted waves, coats of arms, Latin inscriptions, elegant compass roses. One almost forgets the countless hours of soggy fieldwork, hiding beneath all that beauty. Almost. Some decorative features reflected genuine uncertainty. When cartographers lacked reliable information, imagination quietly stepped forward. Unknown coastlines occasionally hosted enormous whales, or suspicious-looking sea serpents, or creatures that appeared to be having a particularly confusing day. It's easy to laugh, but uncertainty has always invited creativity. Modern internet comment sections occasionally demonstrate the same principle. Back in the countryside, surveyors continued collecting fresh information. The land never stopped changing. New polders appeared. Fresh canals were dug. Villages expanded. Storms damaged embankments. Peat extraction created new lakes. Each change demanded revision. Maps became living documents, not permanent truths. This frustrated people who preferred certainty. Unfortunately, geography rarely consulted personal preferences. One especially harsh winter might alter an entire coastline. A single catastrophic flood could erase familiar landmarks forever. Surveyors returned, measured again. Cartographers updated their drawings. History quietly moved forward. Some of the greatest Dutch mapmakers became famous throughout Europe. Others remained anonymous. Their names disappeared. Their work endured. One beautifully drawn map often represented dozens of unseen workers, surveyors, assistants, boatmen, Clerks, engravers, colorists, printers, bookbinders. No single person created the finished masterpiece alone. History often remembers individuals. Reality usually belongs to teams. Printing introduced another remarkable development. Instead of producing one map at a time, workshops could create hundreds. Copper plates carried finely engraved lines. Ink filled every groove. Damp paper pressed firmly against the surface. The image transferred beautifully. Then the entire process began again, patiently, methodically, one sheet after another. Each impression slowly spread Dutch geographical knowledge across Europe. Some maps traveled farther than the surveyors themselves ever would. Imagine spending 20 years measuring quiet Dutch marshes, only for your work to appear centuries later in museums across the world. Not a bad legacy, especially considering how much of it began with wet boots and stubborn determination. Mistakes still slipped through. A copied number, a misplaced symbol, a village drawn slightly too far east. Cartographers corrected future editions whenever possible. Readers sometimes wrote complaints. Officials occasionally demanded revisions. Scholars argued over measurements. In other words, publishing has changed remarkably little. As evening settled outside the workshop, candles flickered gently across unfinished maps. The cartographer leaned back, his eyes tired from hours of careful drawing. A final brush added soft green to a meadow. Blue spread delicately across a canal. A tiny red roof appeared atop a village church. The landscape, once scattered across muddy notebooks and countless footsteps, now rested quietly upon paper, ordered, balanced, understandable, at least until the next flood arrived, because somewhere beyond the workshop windows, the North Sea continued breathing with slow determination. The rivers continued flowing. The peat continued sinking. And tomorrow morning, another surveyor would shoulder his measuring rods, step into another damp field, look toward another endless horizon, and begin measuring the Netherlands all over again. In the next chapter, we'll follow those surveyors as they face their greatest adversary, not human error, but the powerful storms, floods, and shifting coastlines that could erase months of careful work in a single night. End of Part 5, Part 6. When the sea quietly erased the map for all the patience of Dutch surveyors, for all their careful measurements, for every neatly drawn line upon expensive paper, there remained one opponent that simply refused to respect geometry, the North Sea. It never signed agreements. It never acknowledged property boundaries. It certainly never apologized. It simply arrived when the weather allowed, sometimes gently, sometimes with astonishing force. The Dutch had lived beside this restless sea for centuries. They understood its moods better than most Europeans. Yet understanding and controlling are two very different things. A farmer might spend 20 years improving a field. A surveyor might measure every corner with admirable precision. Then one violent winter storm could politely suggest that the field now belonged to the sea. The sea rarely explained its decisions. Storms usually announced themselves slowly. The sky darkened long before rain arrived. Clouds thickened over the western horizon. The wind shifted. Fishing boats hurried home. Millers watched the changing air with quiet concern. experienced sailors became unusually silent. That was often the first warning. When people who earned their living on the water suddenly stopped talking, everyone else paid attention. The surveyor learned to notice these signs, not because he enjoyed meteorology, but because a flooded landscape was remarkably difficult to measure. Heavy rain transformed firm paths into slippery ribbons of mud. Drainage ditches overflowed. Canals rose steadily. Small streams became broad channels. Land that had seemed perfectly dependable only yesterday suddenly resembled an enormous shallow lake. Nature had a wonderfully dry sense of humor. The Dutch response was never to surrender. Instead, they built. Dikes rose along vulnerable coastlines. Earth was piled patiently by thousands of laborers. Clay strengthened weak sections. Wooden piles supported soft ground. Grass covered exposed slopes to reduce erosion. None of it happened quickly. A great dike represented decades of labor, perhaps generations. One family might begin the work. Their grandchildren completed it. History often admires monuments built by kings. Dutch dikes were monuments built by entire communities. There was no dramatic unveiling, no grand celebration, only the quiet satisfaction of remaining dry. Surveyors became essential during these construction projects. Every embankment required careful planning. Too low, the sea crossed it. Too high, unnecessary labor wasted precious resources. Too narrow, it collapsed. Too steep, rain slowly carried it away. Every angle mattered. Every measurement mattered. Imagine trying to explain to hundreds of workers that the top of a dike must be raised by exactly half a meter across several kilometers, without modern machinery, without laser levels, without electronic instruments, only careful observation, simple tools, and extraordinary patience. The Dutch accomplished precisely that, again and again, across centuries. One of the surveyor's most trusted companions during these projects was the leveling instrument. Compared with today's equipment, it looked wonderfully uncomplicated. A wooden frame, a suspended plumb line, sometimes a simple sighting device. Gravity did most of the difficult work. Unlike politicians, gravity remained remarkably consistent. The surveyor positioned the instrument carefully. He waited until the plumb line stopped moving. Only then did he record his observation. Wind complicated everything. A gentle breeze caused the line to sway. Measurements had to wait, sometimes only a minute, sometimes much longer. Patience returned once more as the most valuable tool in the surveyor's collection. Entire teams worked together across open fields. One assistant held a leveling staff. Another recorded numbers. The surveyor peered through his instrument. Voices drifted across the quiet landscape. Raise it. A little lower. There. Simple instructions, repeated hundreds of times each day. The rhythm became almost musical, a calm conversation between mathematics and the countryside. Even birds seemed to pause occasionally, as though curious why humans spent so much effort deciding that one piece of ground sat slightly higher than another. If only they knew. A difference of a few centimeters could determine whether an entire village remained dry during the next storm. Small numbers sometimes carried enormous consequences. Not every flood arrived dramatically. Some appeared almost politely. Water seeped through weak embankments. It collected slowly in low fields. Farmers noticed puddles growing larger each morning. The surveyor noticed something different. His reference markers no longer stood where he expected. One wooden stake leaned slightly, another had disappeared entirely. A third now rested several meters away, moved by ice or water, or perhaps an unusually determined cow. One could never completely rule out livestock. These small changes hinted at larger problems beneath the surface. The ground itself was shifting. Peat soils compressed under their own weight. Drained land slowly settled lower. Fields that once stood safely above surrounding canals gradually sank. The Dutch even developed a quiet expression for this ongoing process. The land was simply sinking, not dramatically, not noticeably, from one day to the next, just enough that each generation inherited a landscape slightly different from the one before. Surveyors measured this slow transformation with remarkable dedication. They became historians of elevation. Winter introduced entirely new challenges. Canals froze, sometimes thick enough to support travelers, sometimes dangerously thin. Snow covered familiar landmarks. Paths disappeared beneath white fields. A measuring stake hidden beneath fresh snow became almost impossible to locate. The surveyor relied upon memory, old notes, nearby trees, church towers rising above the winter landscape. Everything looked cleaner, calmer, and considerably colder. Ink froze, fingers stiffened, metal chains became painfully cold to handle. Even speaking felt different in sharp winter air. Yet, the work continued. The landscape would not wait until spring. Neither could those responsible for protecting it. Some winters brought drifting ice from rivers and estuaries. Huge frozen slabs pressed against dikes with astonishing force. Wood cracked, earth shifted. Protective walls groaned beneath the pressure. Surveyors inspected the damage afterward. Quietly, methodically, they walked the length of weakened embankments, measured new cracks, recorded fresh subsidence, estimated repairs. There was nothing glamorous about the process, but without it, the next storm might prove catastrophic. History often remembers disasters. It rarely remembers the patient inspections that prevented even greater ones. Occasionally, entire maps became obsolete almost overnight. A flood carved a new channel, an embankment failed, a village relocated to higher ground. The surveyor returned, carrying familiar tools into an unfamiliar landscape. His previous measurements remained correct. The world itself had changed. That realization carried a strange humility. No matter how carefully humans recorded reality, reality retained the right to revise itself. Perhaps that is why the finest Dutch surveyors never became arrogant. Experience taught them caution. Nature always had the final edit. As sunset spread, warm colors across recovering floodplains, calm slowly returned. Water reflected the orange sky like polished glass. Windmills resumed their steady turning. Farmers inspected fields. Children wandered safely along repaired paths. Life continued. It always did. The surveyor paused upon a newly strengthened dike. Behind him stretched fertile farmland. Ahead lay the vast gray sea. Between the two stood generations of quiet engineering. Thousands of anonymous workers, thousands of careful measurements, thousands of decisions made with little more than wooden rods, simple mathematics, and remarkable persistence. It was enough. Most days. In the next chapter, we'll leave the countryside for bustling Dutch towns, where wealthy merchants, ambitious governments, and curious scholars transformed surveying from a practical necessity into one of the most respected sciences of the Dutch Golden Age. End of Part 6, Part 7. When surveying became a science. During the Dutch Golden Age, by the early 17th century, something remarkable had happened. The Netherlands had changed, not all at once. History rarely works that way. It happened gradually, canal by canal, harbor by harbor, windmill by windmill. The small provinces that had spent centuries wrestling with water were becoming one of Europe's wealthiest trading powers. Ships sailed from Amsterdam toward Asia. Merchant convoys crossed the Atlantic. Warehouses overflowed with spices, silk, timber, sugar, whale oil, and countless other goods from distant shores. Money flowed into Dutch cities, and where money gathers, so do scholars. Surveying slowly transformed from a practical occupation into something approaching a respected science. Our old surveyor might hardly recognize the younger generation entering the profession. They still owned muddy boots. Some traditions proved impossible to escape, but they also carried better instruments, better notebooks, better mathematics, and perhaps most importantly, better teachers. Amsterdam became one of Europe's great intellectual centers. Books arrived from across the continent. Printers worked almost constantly. Universities exchanged ideas with merchants. Engineers spoke with sailors. Mathematicians argued with astronomers. Cartographers listened to everyone. Knowledge moved through the Dutch Republic almost as efficiently as goods. It was a curious partnership. Commerce paid for science. Science improved commerce. Both benefited from accurate maps. If a merchant knew exactly where a new canal connected two rivers, his cargo arrived sooner. If a ship captain possessed reliable charts, his voyage became safer. If engineers understood the land, new polders could be reclaimed. Surveying quietly supported nearly every success of the Dutch economy. Few people noticed. That is often the fate of essential work. Young apprentices no longer learned solely from experience in muddy fields. They increasingly studied geometry. Euclid's ancient ideas found practical application across Dutch landscapes. Triangles became trusted companions. Angles solved problems that endless walking could not. A clever surveyor realized something profound. He did not always need to measure every distance directly. Sometimes, he could calculate it, stand at one point, measure two angles, record one known distance, then let mathematics accomplish the rest. It sounds obvious today. At the time, it felt almost magical. The countryside slowly surrendered its secrets to geometry. One suspects the countryside was mildly annoyed. Triangulation became one of the great breakthroughs in surveying. Rather than stretching chains endlessly across marshes, surveyors established a network of carefully chosen points: church towers, windmills, tall buildings, occasionally specially constructed observation platforms, each visible from the next, each carefully measured. Together, they formed enormous invisible triangles stretching across entire provinces. The beauty of triangles lies in their stubborn honesty. Unlike people, Triangles rarely change their stories. Once enough measurements were known, the remaining distances revealed themselves through calculation. No argument, no guessing, just mathematics quietly doing what mathematics has always done, being annoyingly correct. Surveyors now spent as much time looking through instruments as walking across fields. The simple compass gradually gained sophisticated companions. Sighting devices became more precise. Graduated circles allowed finer angle measurements. Metal craftsmanship improved. Glass lenses became clearer. None of these innovations appeared overnight. Each represented countless tiny improvements made by instrument makers whose names history seldom remembers. Imagine spending your entire career perfecting a brass screw, so another person could measure an angle 1 minute more accurately. History contains many quiet heroes. Dutch instrument makers earned an excellent reputation. Their workshops echoed with the sound of tiny files smoothing brass, wood shavings curled onto floors, polishing cloths darkened with metal dust. Every instrument demanded extraordinary patience. There were no factories. Each piece was handmade. Every scale carefully engraved. Every line precisely marked. One misplaced division might introduce errors across an entire survey. Precision began long before the surveyor reached the field. It started at the craftsman's workbench. Meanwhile, Dutch cities continued expanding. Canals multiplied. Entire neighborhoods appeared, where marshes had once stretched toward the horizon. Surveyors became permanent employees, rather than occasional visitors. Municipal governments needed roads planned, bridges aligned, property divided, water managed, construction supervised. The city itself became a constantly changing puzzle. Every new warehouse altered drainage. Every bridge affected traffic. Every canal influenced surrounding land. Surveyors balanced all these relationships with remarkable care. Modern urban planners might recognize the work immediately. Only the clothing has changed. One particularly fascinating challenge involved straight streets. The Dutch admired orderly cities. Straight roads looked impressive. They simplified movement. They improved drainage. They also revealed mistakes with embarrassing clarity. A crooked road across open countryside might pass unnoticed. A crooked canal running through the center of Amsterdam announced itself to everyone, including merchants who had paid substantial taxes expecting competence. No surveyor wished to explain why a prestigious canal wandered slightly sideways because someone misread an angle. Professional pride encouraged exceptional accuracy. Maps also became political tools. Borders between provinces mattered. Taxes depended upon reliable property records. Military defenses required careful planning. Governments increasingly commissioned large surveys. These projects sometimes lasted years. Teams of surveyors spread across the countryside simultaneously. Measurements from one district connected with neighboring districts. The map slowly expanded like a giant puzzle. Piece by piece, line by line, village by village. When completed, these surveys represented some of the most accurate geographical records in Europe. Not perfect, but astonishingly advanced for their age. The public slowly developed new respect for maps. Wealthy families purchased beautifully engraved examples. Schools displayed them. Scholars debated them. Travelers carried smaller editions. Maps were no longer merely practical documents. They became symbols of knowledge. Owning a detailed map suggested education, curiosity, perhaps even sophistication, rather like owning an enormous bookshelf today. Whether every book has been read remains another question entirely. The surveyor himself remained surprisingly humble. He still spent long days outdoors, still checked measurements twice, still waited for fog to lift, still worried about rain ruining notebooks. Technology improved. Nature remained wonderfully indifferent. A newly polished instrument could not persuade clouds to disappear, nor could elegant mathematics convince a marsh to become dry. Reality retained its stubborn character. The surveyor simply possessed better ways to understand it. Perhaps the greatest lesson of the Dutch Golden Age was this: progress rarely replaces patience. It rewards it. Every improved instrument still required careful hands. Every clever calculation still depended upon accurate observations. Every beautiful map still began with someone standing quietly beneath an enormous sky, looking toward a distant church tower and wondering, am I really seeing that correctly? That question has driven science for centuries. Not certainty, curiosity, the willingness to measure again, to check once more, to admit that yesterday's answer might need improvement. As evening settled over Amsterdam, lamps glowed warmly behind narrow canal houses. Merchants closed heavy account books. Printers cleaned their presses. Instrument makers extinguished workshop fires. Surveyors rolled fresh maps into protective tubes before beginning another day tomorrow. Outside, canal water reflected rows of golden lights. The city appeared calm, orderly, confident. Yet beneath every bridge, every street, every elegant warehouse, every graceful canal, lay the quiet work of generations who had measured the land one careful observation at a time. And somewhere beyond her, the city, across the endless flat horizon, another anonymous surveyor was already preparing for dawn, because the Netherlands never truly stopped changing, and neither did the maps. End of Part 7, Part 8. Walking the same fields for an entire lifetime. By this point, you might imagine our surveyor had seen nearly everything: floods, fog, frozen canals, argumentative farmers, suspicious cows, wind that seemed personally offended by measuring instruments. Surely there could be little left to surprise him. History, however, has a habit of proving experienced people slightly overconfident. The greatest surprise was not a dramatic disaster, nor a brilliant invention. It was repetition. A surveyor might spend 40 years walking the same countryside, the same canals, the same villages, the same church towers, standing faithfully against the horizon, day after day, season after season, year after year. To an outsider, that life might sound unbearably repetitive. To the surveyor, it revealed something remarkable. The land was never exactly the same twice. Spring arrived quietly across the Dutch countryside. Mist drifted over canals before sunrise. Fresh grass covered the dikes in brilliant shades of green. Willow trees awakened from winter. Farmers repaired fences damaged by storms. Surveyors returned to places they had measured dozens of times before. The notebook changed. The landscape changed. The routine remained comfortingly familiar. Morning often began with birdsong rather than conversation. The surveying team walked together through damp fields while the world slowly woke around them. A fisherman checked his nets. A baker lit the first oven. A miller inspected the morning wind. Somewhere, church bells announced another ordinary day. History is full of extraordinary moments. Most people simply lived ordinary mornings. Our surveyor had developed habits over the years. He always checked his compass before beginning. He sharpened pencils. Well, not quite pencils yet, but charcoal and quills. With almost ritual care, he inspected every measuring chain link for damage. He wiped moisture from brass fittings. His assistants joked that he trusted his instruments more than most people. They were probably correct. Instruments rarely exaggerated stories. Young apprentices continued joining the profession. Most arrived full of confidence. Confidence has always been remarkably inexpensive. Experience costs rather more. One eager apprentice might declare, "The canal hasn't changed." The older surveyor simply smiled. "Measure it." The apprentice returned an hour later, looking puzzled. The western bank moved. It usually does. Another apprentice insisted, "The dike is perfectly straight." Measure it. By evening, he discovered a subtle curve, almost invisible to the naked eye. The countryside rewarded humility. Teaching required patience. Fortunately, surveyors possessed considerable reserves. The older men explained that accurate work depended less upon intelligence than observation. Anyone could glance across a field. Few people truly looked. Notice the leaning fence. Observe the changing water line. Watch where reeds grow thicker. Listen when local fishermen describe unusual tides. Everything mattered. Nothing existed in isolation. The Dutch landscape behaved like a giant machine. Every canal influenced another. Every embankment affected nearby fields. Every sluice gate altered water levels, far beyond its immediate surroundings. Move one piece. The entire system responded. This interconnected world fascinated scholars. It also exhausted surveyors, because every improvement required new measurements. A village expanded. The map changed. A new road appeared. The map changed. A mill burned down. The map changed. Someone reclaimed another section of marsh. The map changed again. One occasionally wonders if the maps ever enjoyed a peaceful retirement. Probably not. The surveyor gradually noticed changes invisible to younger companions. A church tower leaned ever so slightly after decades of settling. An ancient oak grew broader. A familiar farmhouse received a new roof. Children who once waved from roadside fields became adults leading horses of their own. Time measured people as carefully as land. History often speaks in centuries. Human lives unfold in much quieter increments. One harvest, one winter, one spring, again and again. Letters occasionally arrived from neighboring provinces. Another surveyor requested clarification about a boundary. An engineer asked for earlier measurements. A government official sought copies of older maps. These exchanges formed an invisible network connecting professionals across the Dutch Republic. Long before telephones, long before railways, knowledge traveled patiently on horseback, or by canal boat, or inside the saddlebags of determined messengers. Slow, reliable, usually, unless heavy rain delayed everyone, which happened frequently enough that nobody acted particularly surprised. Evenings often ended inside modest inns. Surveyors shared meals with merchants, sailors, farmers, priests, and travelers. Stories drifted around the fire. One sailor described storms in the Baltic. Another merchant spoke of distant ports in Asia. A farmer complained about drainage. Some conversations changed history. Most simply, passed pleasant evenings. The surveyor listened more than he spoke. Listening had become one of his professional habits. The world revealed useful information to patient ears. Occasionally, he unfolded older maps beside newer ones. The differences appeared subtle. A widened canal, a relocated bridge, a fresh windmill, a reclaimed field. Nothing dramatic. Yet when decades separated the maps, the transformation became astonishing. Entire lakes had disappeared. New villages stood where marshes once spread. Roads connected communities that previous generations reached only by boat. The Netherlands had quietly rebuilt itself, not through conquest, not through revolution, but through endless small improvements, measured carefully, recorded faithfully, maintained diligently. Perhaps there is something comforting about that. Great achievements need not arrive all at once. Sometimes they advance one careful step at a time. Of course, not every improvement pleased everyone. Farmers argued over drainage. Merchants wanted deeper canals. Mill owners worried about changing water levels. Fishermen preferred certain tides. Local councils debated budgets. Surveyors stood politely nearby, holding notebooks while everyone explained exactly how the landscape ought to behave. The landscape remained politely unconvinced. Nature rarely attended council meetings. As years passed, the surveyor's hair turned gray. His boots remained muddy. Some traditions proved wonderfully permanent. Younger assistants now carried heavier equipment, while he focused upon observations. Experience had become his greatest instrument. He could glance across distant fields and notice details others overlooked, not because his eyesight improved. Quite the opposite. He simply knew what deserved attention. Wisdom often resembles selective noticing. On one particularly calm evening, he climbed the familiar tower of a village church he had visited since his apprenticeship. The narrow staircase creaked exactly as it always had. The bells waited silently overhead. Stepping onto the viewing platform, he looked across the endless Dutch horizon. Canals reflected the setting sun. Windmills turned slowly in the evening breeze. Thin ribbons of smoke rose from farmhouse chimneys. Boats drifted quietly through distant waterways. It looked peaceful, timeless, yet he knew better than anyone. Every field below had a history. Every straight canal represented years of labor. Every dike concealed countless repairs. Every map in his satchel told only one chapter of a story that never truly ended. He smiled quietly, not because the work was finished. It never would be, but because another generation now carried the measuring rods. Tomorrow morning, they would walk the same familiar paths, notice new changes, correct old errors, add another careful line to another carefully drawn map, and somewhere far in the future, people might look across the astonishing order of the Dutch countryside, never realizing that it had all begun with ordinary men patiently measuring an extraordinarily flat horizon. End of Part 8, Part 9. The quiet mathematics behind every Dutch windmill be now. We've spent countless peaceful hours following surveyors across fields, marshes, and canals. But tonight, we're stopping beside one of the Netherlands' most recognizable landmarks, a windmill. Not because it looks wonderfully Dutch, although it certainly does. Not because painters loved including them, they absolutely did, but because a windmill was far more than a charming feature of the landscape. It was a carefully measured machine. Every successful windmill began long before the first timber was cut. It began with mathematics, quiet, patient, remarkably practical mathematics. Imagine standing with a master millwright and a surveyor on an empty stretch of reclaimed land. There is nothing here except grass, damp earth, and an endless horizon. The millwright points toward the sky. The wind usually comes from there. The surveyor nods and begins writing. Already, the location matters. Too close to a grove of trees, and the sails lose power. Too near another mill, and the airflow becomes disturbed. Too low, and morning fog keeps everything damp. Too high on unstable peat, and the foundation slowly sinks. Finding the right place could take days, sometimes weeks. Patience, once again, proved cheaper than rebuilding an entire windmill. The Dutch understood wind better than many people realize. Not scientifically at first, not with charts and equations, simply through observation. Farmers noticed prevailing breezes. Sailors understood seasonal shifts. Millers memorized years of changing weather. Surveyors gathered these observations and quietly turned them into practical knowledge. The countryside itself became a living weather diary. Every bent tree, every leaning reed, every weathered fence post whispered something about the wind. You merely had to notice. Before construction could begin, the ground required careful examination. The Netherlands was famous for soft soil. Peat looked firm enough until something heavy rested upon it. Then the ground politely reconsidered its opinion. Large windmills weighed many tons. Wood, stone, brick, massive gears, rotating machinery, everything pressed downward. Without proper preparation, the mill would settle unevenly. Doors refused to close. Walls cracked. Gears slipped. Eventually, the sails themselves became difficult to operate. None of these outcomes pleased the owner, especially after spending a small fortune on construction. Surveyors therefore measured the land with extraordinary care. They identified stronger ground. They estimated future settling. They advised where wooden foundation piles should be driven. Thousands of oak piles disappeared beneath Dutch buildings during these centuries, invisible from the surface, absolutely essential beneath it. Modern visitors often admire elegant canal houses. Few think about the forest hidden underground supporting them. History's greatest achievements frequently depend upon things nobody sees. Foundation work proceeded slowly. Workers drove pile after pile into the soft earth. The rhythmic sound echoed across the flat countryside. Thump, pause, thump, pause, hour after hour, sometimes for weeks. The surveyor occasionally returned to verify alignment. A few centimeters mattered. The foundation determined everything above it. This is one of history's recurring lessons. Strong foundations rarely receive applause. Weak ones receive immediate attention. Once construction began, measurement never truly stopped. Every beam required precise placement. The central shaft had to stand perfectly vertical. The rotating cap needed exact balance. Even tiny errors multiplied dramatically as machinery grew larger. Imagine building a clock several stories tall. One slightly crooked component eventually affects everything else. Windmills demanded that level of precision without electricity, without power tools, without computer models, only craftsmanship, experience, and careful observation. The surveyor and the millwright formed an unusual partnership. One understood the land, the other understood the machine. Neither could succeed completely without the other. The surveyor might identify the perfect location. If the millwright ignored prevailing winds, the mill underperformed. The millwright might build magnificent machinery. If the surveyor selected unstable ground, the entire structure slowly tilted. History often celebrates brilliant individuals. Reality usually rewards successful cooperation. From the top platform of a completed windmill, the surveyor enjoyed one of the finest views in the Netherlands. The countryside unfolded in every direction. Straight canals reflected the sky. Fields formed neat rectangles. Roads connected villages like carefully drawn lines. Church towers rose gently above clusters of rooftops. Other windmills stood upon distant horizons, their sails turning slowly in the breeze. From above, the landscape resembled a giant geometric puzzle. One could almost imagine the map spread across the earth itself. Perhaps this is why surveyors loved high places, not because climbing narrow ladders was enjoyable. It rarely was, but because elevation revealed order hidden from ground level. Perspective transformed confusion into clarity. Windmills also became excellent landmarks, visible for miles, easy to identify, difficult to mistake. Unlike haystacks, haystacks possessed an unfortunate tendency to disappear whenever farmers became hungry for livestock bedding. A windmill generally remained where it had been built. Surveyors frequently marked them upon maps. Travelers navigated toward them. Boat captains used them to judge position across low coastal landscapes. Entire communities organized themselves around these towering structures. They were machines. They were landmarks. They were symbols. Few buildings worked harder. Some mills specialized in pumping water rather than grinding grain. These drainage mills became heroes of reclaimed land. Their giant scoop wheels, or later, screw pumps, lifted water from lower fields into higher canals. It happened slowly, quietly, continuously, one rotation after another, hour after hour, day after day, sometimes month after month. The process lacked dramatic excitement. It possessed something far more valuable: reliability. Without these mills, countless Dutch polders would gradually return to marsh. The surveyor therefore paid close attention to water levels surrounding every drainage system. A newly reclaimed field might appear perfectly dry. Measurements revealed otherwise. The ground continued settling. Drainage required adjustment. Canals required widening. Another mill might become necessary. The work never truly ended. Visitors from abroad often expressed amazement. How had such a small country organized its landscape with such precision? The answer disappointed those hoping for a dramatic secret. There wasn't one, only countless ordinary people doing careful work exceptionally well. Surveyors, millwrights, carpenters, brickmakers, boatmen, dike workers, engineers, farmers. Every generation improved a small piece of the larger puzzle. No single person created the Dutch landscape. Millions of patient decisions did. As sunset painted the sky in soft shades of orange and lavender, the sails of nearby windmills slowed with the evening breeze. The surveyor rested against the wooden railing high above the fields. He unfolded one of his maps. Below him stretched the very lines he had drawn years earlier. A canal here, a road there, a new embankment, another reclaimed meadow. The map no longer felt like ink on paper. It had become reality. That must have been one of the quiet joys of the profession, to watch careful measurements slowly transform into the living world around you. Not overnight, not through miracles, simply through patience. Tomorrow, our journey will continue into the bustling ports of the Dutch Republic, where these carefully crafted maps guided merchants, navigators, and explorers toward distant oceans, and where a surveyor's quiet work eventually helped shape the global age of exploration. End of Part 9, Part 10. From quiet Dutch fields to the edge of the world. For most of his career, our surveyor rarely traveled farther than a few neighboring provinces. His world consisted of canals, windmills, church towers, pastures, and the wonderfully stubborn geography of the Low Countries. He probably never imagined that his careful measurements would one day help sailors navigate halfway around the globe. Yet that is exactly what happened. History often works through unexpected connections. A man measuring a drainage ditch outside Haarlem quietly influenced a captain sailing toward Japan. Neither would ever meet. Both depended upon accurate maps. By the early 17th century, the Dutch Republic had become one of the greatest maritime powers in the world. Its harbors buzzed with activity from dawn until long after sunset. Amsterdam, Rotterdam, Hoorn, Enkhuizen, Middelburg. These ports never seemed entirely asleep. Ships arrived carrying timber from Scandinavia, grain from the Baltic, wine from France, salt from Portugal, silks and spices from Asia, sugar from the Caribbean. The docks smelled of tar, wet rope, fresh-cut oak, sea salt, smoke from countless chimneys, and occasionally fish that had remained optimistic about being sold while clearly having missed their opportunity. Harbor life was never particularly delicate. Surveyors entering these ports encountered an entirely different landscape. Gone were the quiet meadows and lonely windmills. Instead, every street seemed alive. Porters pushed heavy carts over cobblestones. Shipwrights hammered oak planks into massive hulls. Merchants argued over prices. Sailors shouted across crowded wharves. Children darted between warehouses carrying messages. Even the seagulls appeared unusually busy. One suspects they maintained an efficient system for stealing unattended lunches. They have certainly perfected the technique today. The surveyor's role expanded dramatically. Cities required detailed plans for new docks. Warehouses needed foundations capable of supporting enormous cargoes. Canals had to be widened. Harbors deepened. Bridges strengthened. Every improvement demanded fresh measurements. The bustling port changed almost monthly. A map drawn 5 years earlier quickly became outdated. Commerce moved too quickly. Prosperity rarely stood still. One of the greatest engineering challenges involved the harbor itself. Water depth mattered enormously. A ship drawing 4 meters of water required more than 4 meters beneath its keel. Tides complicated the calculation. Sandbanks shifted constantly. River currents deposited fresh sediment. Storms rearranged channels overnight. Surveyors therefore collaborated closely with pilots and sailors. The sailor knew where ships struggled. The surveyor explained why. Together, they slowly improved navigation. Harbor surveys required boats specially equipped for measurement. These vessels moved slowly through channels, while crews lowered weighted lines into the water, again and again, depth after depth, every sounding carefully recorded. The process demanded astonishing concentration. A distracted assistant might misread a knot. A tired clerk might copy the wrong number. One simple mistake could eventually place a large merchant vessel onto a sandbank. Merchants rarely appreciated unexpected contact with the seabed. The weighted sounding line became one of the simplest, yet most valuable tools aboard. A rope, a heavy lead weight, knots tied at carefully measured intervals. Remarkably uncomplicated, remarkably effective. Some lead weights even contained a hollow base filled with tallow. When lowered to the bottom, tiny samples of mud, sand, or shell fragments stuck to the waxy surface. By examining them, sailors learned not only the depth, but also the nature of the seabed: soft mud, coarse sand, fine gravel. Each told its own quiet story, long before underwater cameras, long before sonar. People literally brought pieces of the ocean floor back to the deck. History occasionally solves complicated problems with charming simplicity. The Dutch East India Company depended heavily upon this growing body of geographical knowledge. Ships leaving Amsterdam faced journeys lasting many months. Every reliable chart reduced risk. Every corrected coastline improved safety. Every accurately surveyed harbor increased the chance that valuable cargo would return home. Maps became commercial assets, almost strategic secrets. Some charts remained carefully guarded. Knowledge itself had become valuable merchandise. Back in Amsterdam, map publishers worked tirelessly. New discoveries arrived constantly. Captains returned from distant voyages carrying journals. Pilots submitted corrected observations. Surveyors delivered fresh measurements from canals and coastlines. Printers transformed this information into elegant atlases admired throughout Europe. One could walk into certain workshops and witness geography itself evolving page by page. What a remarkable sight that must have been. Not every report proved accurate. Far from it. One captain estimated an island's position. Another disagreed by several kilometers. Clouds obscured coastlines. Storms pushed ships off course. Magnetic compasses behaved unpredictably in unfamiliar regions. Cartographers compared every account with cautious skepticism. Good maps demanded evidence, not enthusiasm. The distinction remains useful today. Interestingly, many famous Dutch mapmakers rarely traveled great distances themselves. Instead, they became masters of collecting information. Letters arrived from distant colonies. Ship logs crossed oceans. Government officials submitted surveys. Missionaries described unfamiliar rivers. Merchants sketched coastlines, observed during trade voyages. The cartographer assembled these fragments into coherent pictures of the world, rather like constructing a giant puzzle without knowing whether every piece truly belonged. Meanwhile, our countryside surveyor occasionally visited Amsterdam to deliver updated provincial maps. The city always amazed him. So many people, so many ships, so many languages, merchants from England, sailors from Scandinavia, visitors from Germany, ambassadors from Italy, travelers carrying stories from places he could scarcely imagine. Yet, despite all this international excitement, the mapmakers still cared deeply about one quiet Dutch canal measured to the nearest rod. Precision at home supported confidence abroad. There is something wonderfully poetic about that connection. The same careful habits used to mark a farmer's pasture also helped chart distant oceans. The same mathematics guided both drainage canals and merchant fleets. The same patience served equally well in peaceful meadows and crowded harbors. Knowledge rarely remains confined to its original purpose. Once discovered, it quietly finds new journeys. As evening settled over Amsterdam's harbor, hundreds of masts stood silhouetted against the fading sky. Rigging creaked gently in the breeze. Lanterns flickered aboard anchored ships. Water lapped softly against weathered wooden piers. Inside nearby workshops, cartographers rolled fresh maps into protective cases. Some would remain in Dutch libraries. Others would cross continents. Still, others would sail into oceans where blank spaces still waited to be understood. And somewhere beyond the city's bustle, far from the noise of merchants and sailors, an elderly surveyor walked home along a peaceful canal. His boots were muddy. His notebook was nearly full. His day's work seemed wonderfully ordinary. He could not possibly know that countless future travelers would benefit from the quiet accuracy of people just like him. History rarely announces its greatest contributions. Sometimes, it simply measures them. End of Part 10. Part 11. The apprentices who inherited the horizon. Morning arrived gently over the Low Countries. A pale mist rested across the canals. The sails of distant windmills stood almost motionless, waiting for the first dependable breeze. Dew clung to every blade of grass. Somewhere beyond the fog, a rooster announced the sunrise with absolute confidence. Whether anyone appreciated the announcement remained uncertain. History is strangely silent on the opinions of sleepy apprentices. Our aging surveyor had reached a point in life where he no longer walked quite as quickly as he once had. His knees reminded him of every muddy ditch he had crossed over the last 40 years. His shoulders remembered every measuring rod he had carried. Even climbing a church tower required a brief pause halfway up. Not because he doubted himself, simply because time, unlike surveying, refuses to be measured backward. It only moves in one direction, quietly, patiently, without consulting anyone. The younger apprentices noticed these changes. They also noticed something else. The old surveyor almost never became lost, even in thick morning fog. Even when familiar landmarks disappeared, he somehow knew where he was. One apprentice finally gathered enough courage to ask, "How do you always know which way we're facing?" The old surveyor smiled beneath his weathered hat. "I listen." The apprentice looked around. There was almost nothing to hear, only distant birds, a soft breeze, water moving lazily through a drainage ditch. The old man pointed across the fields. The church bell, a faint ringing, drifted through the mist. "That's east." Then he pointed again. The windmill, its sails creaked slowly. "Somewhere beyond the fog." "That's north." Finally, He tapped the damp ground with his walking stick, and this path always stays dry after heavy rain. The apprentice frowned. I never noticed? No, the old surveyor replied gently. You were looking. You weren't observing. That small lesson remained with the apprentice for years. Surveying had never been merely about numbers. It was about paying attention. Really paying attention. Anyone could carry a measuring chain. Anyone could write figures into a notebook. Far fewer people noticed that reeds grew differently, where groundwater rose closer to the surface, or that certain birds nested only near stable embankments, or that moss gathered more heavily on the sheltered side of old boundary stones. Nature offered countless tiny clues. Most people walked past them without a second thought. Surveyors learned to notice them all. Training usually lasted many years. An apprentice began with simple tasks. Carry the rods, hold the chain, hammer the stakes. Write the measurements exactly as spoken. Not almost exactly, exactly. At first, the work seemed disappointingly ordinary. The young apprentice imagined he would spend his days making important decisions. Instead, he spent much of his first summer carrying equipment through wet grass. Occasionally, he was trusted with a notebook. This felt like an enormous promotion, mostly because the notebook remained dry. The older surveyors watched carefully, not to criticize, although criticism certainly happened, but because tiny habits revealed future professionals. Did the apprentice clean the brass compass before storing it? Did he double-check written numbers? Did he keep the measuring chain free of tangled links? These details mattered. Sloppy equipment usually produced sloppy measurements. History rarely rewarded carelessness. The North Sea certainly didn't. One rainy afternoon, the surveying party sought shelter inside a modest farmhouse. The farmer welcomed them warmly. His wife placed fresh bread, thick cheese, smoked herring, and warm soup upon the wooden table. Steam rose gently into the cool air. Everyone removed heavy boots by the door. The room instantly became much more comfortable and considerably more fragrant. Wet leather possesses a scent that history books politely ignore, perhaps for everyone's benefit. As rain tapped softly against the windows, conversation drifted toward older maps. The farmer disappeared into another room before returning with a rolled piece of parchment. Carefully, he spread it across the table. It showed the farm exactly as his grandfather had known it, or almost exactly. The surveyor leaned closer. One canal had vanished. Another appeared farther west. The orchard was smaller. The road curved differently. Even the farmhouse itself occupied a slightly different position. The apprentice stared in surprise. I thought maps were permanent. The older surveyor shook his head. No, they're honest. They simply tell the truth about a particular moment. And moments change. Outside, the rain eventually stopped. Sunlight broke through the clouds. Tiny drops sparkled on willow branches. The surveying party continued their journey. The apprentice now looked differently at every field they crossed. He realized the landscape possessed a memory, not written in words, written in shapes, old riverbanks, abandoned drainage channels, ancient dikes now covered with wildflowers, forgotten boundaries, visible only when the afternoon sun struck the ground at just the right angle. The countryside preserved its own history. If one knew how to read it, During harvest season, surveying became considerably more complicated. Fields that had stood open all spring were now crowded with workers. Stacks of grain interrupted sight lines. Wagons rattled along narrow tracks. Children chased geese between haystacks. Dogs barked enthusiastically at absolutely everything. The surveyor smiled. Measurements could wait. Harvest could not. There was little point insisting upon a perfectly straight line while a family hurried to gather crops before the next rainstorm. Good surveyors understood timing as well as geometry. Autumn painted the Dutch countryside with gentle shades of gold and brown. Leaves drifted slowly into quiet canals. Morning fog returned more frequently. The old surveyor noticed his apprentice making fewer mistakes. He no longer needed constant reminders. The measuring chain remained straight. The notebook stayed organized. Compass readings were checked twice. Progress had arrived quietly, much like everything else worth admiring. One evening, as they packed their equipment beside an old windmill, the apprentice asked another question. Will the land ever stop changing? The older man looked across the endless horizon. Fields stretched toward distant villages. Canals reflected the orange sky. Smoke rose peacefully from cottage chimneys. For a long moment, he said nothing. Finally, he answered, "I hope not." The apprentice looked puzzled. Why? Because if the land stops changing, it probably means the people have. There was a gentle wisdom hidden inside that reply. The Netherlands existed because generations refused to accept the landscape exactly as they found it. They improved it, protected it, measured it, adjusted it again and again, without expecting perfection, only progress. As darkness slowly settled across the countryside, the surveying team began walking home. Their footsteps echoed softly along the top of a grassy dike. The apprentice carried the measuring rods now. The older surveyor carried only the notebook. It felt somehow appropriate. Knowledge, like equipment, eventually passes into younger hands. The horizon remained unchanged. The people beneath it did not. Tomorrow, another dawn would arrive. Another mist would cover the fields. Another careful measurement would quietly join thousands that came before it. And the story of the Dutch landscape would continue, one patient generation at a time. End of Part 11, Part 12, The Surveyor Who Watched the Seasons. Instead of the clock by now, our surveyor had spent so many years outdoors that he no longer thought about time the way most people did. He rarely looked at a clock. In fact, for much of his career, there wasn't much point. Mechanical clocks certainly existed. Dutch towns proudly displayed them on church towers. But out in the countryside, the sun remained a far more dependable companion. The surveyor measured his days differently, by the position of shadows, by the changing color of the sky, by the sound of birds beginning their morning chorus, by the slow opening of flowers beside drainage canals. Nature became both calendar and clock, and unlike many human inventions, it almost never forgot to arrive. Spring always announced itself quietly, not with dramatic fanfare, simply with small changes that only careful observers noticed. The frozen ground softened. The first frogs returned to shallow ponds. Young reeds pushed through muddy banks. Morning air carried the faint smell of damp earth waking after winter. To most travelers, it simply felt like warmer weather. To a surveyor, it meant another working season had begun. Winter notebooks could finally be compared against living landscapes once again. Every spring, the first survey of the year carried a certain excitement. What had changed? Had the dikes survived? Did winter ice damage the canals? Were the boundary markers still standing? Sometimes the answers were encouraging, sometimes not so much. A single harsh winter could split wooden posts. Floodwaters might carry away carefully placed stones. Entire drainage ditches could fill with silt. The surveyor greeted each surprise with the same quiet expression, a gentle sigh. Then he reached for his notebook. Summer brought longer days. This delighted the apprentices. More daylight meant more progress. The older surveyor knew better. Longer daylight also meant more heat, more insects, more mosquitoes drifting lazily over marshland. History rarely celebrates the mosquito, yet it has influenced an astonishing number of human occupations. Surveyors became experts at ignoring persistent buzzing around their ears. If they stopped working every time an insect became annoying, the Netherlands might never have been mapped. The midday sun created another problem. Heat shimmered above wet ground. Distant windmills appeared to dance. Church towers seemed to bend slightly. Straight roads looked strangely curved. Optical illusions became surprisingly common. Young apprentices occasionally insisted the compass was wrong. The older surveyor simply smiled. The compass isn't confused. The air is. He had learned this lesson decades earlier. Never argue with afternoon heat, simply wait. By evening, the horizon usually returned to its sensible shape. Patience solved another problem. It often did. Summer also meant haymaking. The countryside became wonderfully busy. Farmers worked from sunrise until dusk. Children gathered fallen stalks. Horses pulled heavy wagons. The smell of freshly cut grass drifted across open fields. Surveyors adjusted their routes accordingly. There was little value in measuring directly through someone's harvest. Good relationships with local communities mattered almost as much as accurate calculations, after all. Today's helpful farmer might become tomorrow's valuable witness. During a boundary dispute, autumn arrived with quieter colors. Golden fields slowly disappeared after harvest. Trees reflected softly in calm canals. Morning fog returned with remarkable determination. Sometimes the surveying team waited hours before distant landmarks emerged from the mist. At first, apprentices found these delays frustrating. Eventually, they learned to appreciate them. There are worse places to spend a quiet morning than beside a Dutch canal, while mist slowly lifts beneath the rising sun. Even history occasionally pauses for beauty. During these waiting periods, the old surveyor often shared stories, not dramatic adventures. His profession contained surprisingly few sword fights. Instead, he spoke about forgotten surveyors whose names survived only in faded records. One man became famous for measuring an entire province twice because he distrusted his own results. Another spent 3 decades improving local water management without ever publishing a single book. A third corrected a mapping error that had confused travelers for nearly 50 years. None became household names. all quietly improved the world around them. History owes much to people who never expected applause. Winter transformed everything. The countryside became almost silent. Snow softened familiar shapes. Canals froze into smooth ribbons of pale gray. Even sound seemed different. Footsteps became sharper. Voices carried farther across cold air. Church bells echoed beautifully over frozen fields. Surveying continued whenever conditions allowed, though everyone secretly hoped for shorter days. Warm fireplaces possessed undeniable advantages over frozen marshes on particularly cold mornings. The surveyor wrapped his hands around a warm clay mug before beginning work. Hot broth, sometimes weak beer, heated gently, occasionally spiced cider, if fortune smiled. The warmth rarely lasted long. Once outside, still, it made those first few minutes considerably more pleasant. Apprentices quickly discovered another winter lesson: never touch frozen metal with wet fingers. History contains many educational experiences. Some are more uncomfortable than others. The surveyor gradually realized he no longer thought in months. He thought in water levels. This canal is lower than last spring. That marsh stayed flooded longer than usual. The western dike survived another winter. His memory organized itself around landscapes rather than dates. Ask him what happened 20 years earlier. He might hesitate. Ask him about the flood that reached the third willow tree beside the northern embankment. He remembered immediately. Places anchored memory. Perhaps they still do. One particularly clear winter afternoon, the surveying team stood upon a frozen canal. The ice stretched away beneath a pale blue sky. Children skated in the distance. Merchants pulled small sledges loaded with goods. The entire waterway had temporarily become a road. The apprentice laughed. I never imagined boats could become people. The older surveyor chuckled softly. In the Netherlands, water is whatever the weather decides. It was a wonderfully Dutch answer. Practical, simple, entirely true. As another year drew quietly toward its close, the surveyor carefully organized his notebooks. Each volume represented hundreds of miles walked, thousands of observations, countless conversations, small corrections, large discoveries, nothing dramatic by itself. Together, they described an entire country growing wiser about its own landscape. The notebooks filled shelves inside modest offices. Future surveyors would consult them. Future engineers would rely upon them. Future generations might never know who first wrote those careful lines, yet they would unknowingly benefit from them every single day. That is one of history's gentlest forms of immortality. The old surveyor closed the final notebook of the season. Outside, evening settled slowly across the canals. A distant windmill completed another lazy turn. Smoke drifted upward from scattered cottages. Somewhere across the quiet countryside, another apprentice was preparing his equipment for tomorrow. Another chain, another compass, another blank page waiting to become part of history. And above them all stretched the same endless Dutch horizon, patiently waiting to be measured once again. End of Part 12 Art. 13. The boundary stones that outlived their owners. There was one object a Dutch surveyor trusted almost as much as his measuring instruments. It was a good boundary stone. Not an impressive monument, not a towering pillar carved with heroic victories. Just a modest block of stone, half buried in the earth, usually ignored by everyone except the people whose property depended upon it, and occasionally by cows that found it useful for scratching an itch. History has a delightful way of making ordinary things extraordinarily important. A boundary stone was one of those things. Long before modern land registries, long before digital maps, long before anyone could zoom in on a satellite image with 2 fingers, the boundary stone quietly announced, "This land ends here." Nothing more, nothing less. Simple words, enormous consequences. Fields meant food. Food meant survival. Land meant wealth, inheritance, security. A misplaced stone could influence generations. Placing one required surprising ceremony. Surveyors did not simply drop a rock into the nearest patch of grass. The location had to be agreed upon. Measurements checked, witnesses gathered, local officials occasionally attended, neighbors watched carefully. Everyone wanted to remember exactly where the stone stood, not approximately, exactly. The surveyor measured the final position one last time. His assistant held the rod steady. Another compared notes. Only after every calculation matched did laborers lower the stone into its prepared hole. Earth was packed firmly around it. Sometimes small stones surrounded the base to discourage movement. Sometimes the marker bore an engraved symbol, a coat of arms, an initial, a simple cross, nothing elaborate. Its value came from its position rather than its appearance. Some boundary stones concealed little secrets. Surveyors occasionally buried broken pottery, charcoal, bricks, or small pieces of tile beneath them. If someone later tried moving the stone, those hidden markers would reveal the disturbance. It was a wonderfully clever idea, almost medieval tamper-proof technology. Move the stone, disturb the evidence, reveal the deception. Human ingenuity has always found interesting ways to discourage cheating because, unsurprisingly, people occasionally tried. Most disputes began quietly. One farmer noticed his neighbor plowing a little farther than usual. Another thought a fence looked suspiciously new. Someone insisted a drainage ditch had slowly drifted over the years. Technically, drainage ditches cannot drift.